This is Simone,
And this is Katinka.
and you are listening to the Novotech podcast. We live in a time when technology is changing faster than ever before and transforming the way we live and interact with the world. The question is, how do we keep up?
In this podcast, we'll interview real people and certainly hear their tips on how to learn, adapt, and succeed in this ever-changing world of technology. Are you ready? Hello everyone. Today we are talking to Ned Letcher, a software engineer / data scientist at ThoughtWorks. Ned has a PhD in computational linguistics. We talked a great deal about data science trends and tools, and he has some valuable advice for those wanting to enter this field. He's also an active networker, has a strong presence on Twitter, and he runs the DataViz meetup in Melbourne. Hi Ned, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi Ned, looking forward to this conversation.
So Ned, you have many talents. You're a software engineer, a data scientist, Python trainer, and you also run a meetup. But before we dive into all this, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into tech.
Yeah, sure. So I've been working as a data science consultant for the last few years. Before that, I was in academia. So I was doing a PhD and was keen to escape the ivory tower. I think halfway through my PhD, it became clear to me that I was way more enjoying creating software tools that the researchers I was working with would be using. And so I spent more time sort of, tweaking the little interfaces I was making and sort of realized that applied usage of tech, data, analytic stuff was what I wanted to get into. And so I made a pivot into world of industry from there. At the moment, I'm working at ThoughtWorks, helping organizations build data-driven products and platforms and more data-driven cultures. The way I got into the PhD was possibly not the best reason to start a PhD, which was that I didn't really know what else to do. And so I had been doing computer science and philosophy and linguistics, and then worked out that there was actually an area of research that was the intersection of all these things, computational linguistics, where you got to use computational techniques to study the phenomenon of language. And I found that fascinating. I got into that, but then kind of worked out that while the study was great, I just don't think I was that great a researcher. And so, as I said before, the applied side of things was really what drew me. And then luckily, as it happened, a lot of the skills that you end up learning when you're doing computational linguistics, studying language with computational means, ends up being the same sort of skills that you use for, natural language processing, which is an applied usage of that set of skills where you're trying to extract information from language and do things with it. So whether you're doing the search engine, sort of like pulling out documents or, all that sort of stuff, which we can certainly talk more about later.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, that is a segue for our next question, that you can explore what you want more exactly in the computational linguistics. You mentioned about, the linguistic itself and probably other things around it. But how do you apply these in your work? You said that you like to be helping companies building data-driven tools, etc. So what have you learned in your PhD in the computational linguistics? How do you apply that into your work or even to your life?
Yeah, interesting. I guess there's a couple of dimensions there. So there's, obviously there's some of the more fundamental skills that came out of that, natural language processing foundations that I now do get to use on some of the projects that I'm involved in. So I very much look forward to projects involving text. And I can talk some about some of those particular applications. But I think it's not just the technical skills that came out of my research and my PhD. So there's the process of doing research. When you're doing data science, you're very much you sort of have to think about what's the goal that you're trying to achieve. What are we trying to learn about? What hypotheses are we trying to answer? And so you have to think about experimental design, data collection. So part of my research, I had to create some data sets, and these are some of the harder parts of data science. The thing that people say is, in the real world, data science is not a Kaggle competition. You don't get your data sets kind of all cleanly prepared for you. And you actually have to not only do data cleaning, but data collection, thinking about how was it captured? And, if you are getting people to label your data, making sure that the annotators agree and things like that. So there was that side of it, which regularly comes up in some of these projects. But then I think there's also I mentioned before that part of what I enjoyed in the research was designing tooling that researchers would use. And so I think thinking about when you're a data scientist, and this is true for a lot of data and software more generally, is like you have a user in mind, you have to work out what their needs are. And I think it's possibly an area in data science that in software engineering, this is sort of fairly well understood, and that you need to have your discovery sessions and have your experience designers and all this sort of stuff. But if you're a data scientist, you have consumers as well. And whether they're the consumers of the product that ultimately is being developed by the company you work for, but they could also be in-house consumers. And you have to work out, well, what's their needs? What's actually valuable for them? And so that process of consultation, working out what's going to be useful, I think, because it's very easy to I'm going to build this interface, and you have all these great ideas about how it's going to do the cool things. But then when you actually sit someone down in front of it, it may not go as you expect. And so understanding that you can't just sort of like madly iterate and ideate without a sounding board. So I think that was another part that came out of my experiences from the PhD.
Yeah, that's really cool. And obviously, natural language processing is a hot topic in the world of data science. So I'm wondering, what do you see the future of natural language processing to be like? Do you think it's going to play an important role in technology, but maybe even in our everyday life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's only going to get increasingly important. We will see more of it coming through in our day-to-day lives. There's probably better people to ask than myself about this. I try to stay on top of things from an applied sort of context in the here and the now. And so there are sort of, obviously researchers working and can probably see a bit more where things are going. I'm happy to speculate wildly. I think if we're talking about some of these topics, it's hard to ignore the recent GPT-3 that was released by OpenAI, which is a massive deep learning language model trained over just absolutely huge amounts of internet text. So I think the first version of GPT-2 had 1.5 billion parameters, nodes in the net that it's being trained over. The GPT-3 had 175 billion, and people have estimated that it cost 12 million to train. So this is this massive, humongous model. Now, there's a lot of hype that people have been saying, oh, it's this crazily intelligent thing, and look what it can do. And I think there's a lot of overhype. I think people are probably often missing the mark, but it's actually a super amazing model. I've seen it producing really amazing sounding poetry when you ask it to produce, like, say, esoteric, algebraic, math-inspired poetry, and it spits out something that's like, wow, that's really cool. You can give it French and English, and it'll actually spit out a translation, even though it wasn't trained to do translation. It's just learnt about the fact that it can map between these languages, which is kind of mind-boggling, really. Even crazy things like being able to generate a functioning React web app, given a small one, but given an English language specification of what it should do. And I think that's some of the examples of why people are so excited by it. It's important to understand that this model is not actually truly intelligent. In a sense, it's sort of memorizing patterns of inputs in a way that is intelligent sounding and quite amazing. So I think we will see more of these sorts of models, and they will get cheaper to train over time. We will start to see more of these models emerging, possibly in the context of, if you think about conversational agents we have at the moment, they're a bit limited. They don't really go off script very well. They sound a bit stilted. These sorts of models, I think, could allow these conversational agents to sound a lot more natural and less stilted and ad-lib. The challenge, of course, is that they can't ad-lib off topic beyond things that they're meant to be talking about, or say things that are not true. That's, I think, the challenge for these agents. And yeah, just thinking about this particular idea of massive sort of model, there's other models like GPT-3, and we'll see more of them. Even though it's not actually an intelligent agent, I kind of like the idea. I've sort of thought about this thought experiment of, imagine if in a few thousand years or whatever it is, if in the unfortunate scenario where our civilization disappears for whatever reason, I hope that doesn't happen, but if it were to, and you imagined an alien civilization picking up all of the collective knowledge from the internet just lying around in digital form, if you had access to that, you could pump that into one of these models. What you would have is not a living representation, not an consciousness, but it would be this kind of zombie-like thing that when you ask it questions, it would respond in a way as if it was a real-life person from that civilization. And you would kind of get to pretend and simulate what would it be like to talk to someone from our day and age. Or, if you wanted to be more positive about this, we could imagine the same scenario on where the aliens coming and visiting and we're recovering some other long civilization. So I think we will see more from these sorts of models and language models in general. It's definitely an exciting space.
I love that, yeah.
Over a year ago, longer than that, there was a story about some bots that they were created. And then after only a few hours engage in talking to humans, they become racist. Yeah, of course, they are being trained, listening to whatever environment they are. So they're going to pick up, it's like a kid, right? It's going to pick up what's in the environment. But from your perspective, with your experience, your knowledge and everything, why that happened or what could be different and whatever you think that's interesting on this topic.
So I think this is the example of, I think it was Microsoft's Tay. Yeah, and they released this conversational agent. They were very excited about it. It seemed like a pretty cool thing, but it didn't have any guardrails and checks in place. And so the internet came across it, and the internet does what it tends to do, probably people from 4chan or whatnot. And they just started trolling the bot and teaching it horrible things. And I guess there's a few things there. I think it does speak a little bit towards the naivete of the people who released it. Like, this could have been anticipated. If you've spent any amount of time on the internet, I guess it does depend on which parts you hang out in, but I think this could have been anticipated. There's certainly that, but I mean, it does show that these models are not intelligent. They just do what they're trained to do. And so you have to think about that when you're putting it out. There's other examples of this. I think the other one that's often brought up is Amazon, and they had this hiring model based on CVs, and it ended up learning a whole bunch of things that were just attributes of male candidates. Things like, this is in the States, I presume, mainly like whether it was like polo or something. And it was like, yeah, well, of course that's going to happen. The data was biased in that sense. So if you don't think about what goes into the model, you will be surprised by the output, and often unpleasantly. And so I think there's that at a very fundamental level of how you're sort of setting up the way that people interact with it or the way it's being used. That's something that's come up in some of my work a bit more recently, is when you've got a model that you're deploying, you really have to start thinking about the greater life cycle of the model. And there's all these operational concerns that you have to start thinking about. These are usually statistical models. They're going to do strange things. So we need to actually account for some of these outliers. So even when we have thought a bit about biased data sets and we've done due diligence there, you're going to get situations where it will say something. If it's a classification model, whatever you're classifying, there may be some scenario where, whether it's because of regulation or just the bottom line of the business, that's not an acceptable answer. We have to step in. And so there's always going to be the need for deterministic quality assurance wrappers around these models. And I think the mistake is to be all super excited about having trained this amazing model that gets whatever F score, and then you're like, cool, let's deploy it. And it's great that you've got to that point and you're excited about it, but there's more to it. And yeah, you need to have a bit more of the pieces of the puzzle to have in place before dropping things and going live.
So it means that, well, it's still truth, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, no, I mean, right. There's exactly. It's a lot of truth to that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about other NLP projects you have worked on?
Some of the projects I've worked on, I've used a few different NLP techniques that have come up. I've done some text classification models. There's something quite satisfying about training a classifier. The challenge there, of course, is getting the data. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec, but I guess some other models that I've looked at, just sort of doing more general text analytics in social media. So mining things like Twitter feeds and seeing what keywords are trending can be quite useful for things like market research. And then, yeah, when you don't have labeled data, then, you sort of have to turn to, in machine learning, what we talk about, unsupervised techniques. So you don't have ground truth labels for if it's text categorization, like what the different labels are, like if you're tagging types of documents and things like that. If you don't have that data at hand, then you have to look for unsupervised approaches. So topic modeling is a good example, where you look at emerging patterns or groupings of words. So one project I worked on there was call center analysis. So you could look at, well, what are the different kinds of things that people talk about? And so I guess that's an interesting approach, because often the business has a certain idea about things like a call center, what are the categories that, or the groups that people talk about? I mean, often they might be talking about multiple things, but the topic modeling approaches and clustering, they can help you come up with data-driven groupings. And so you're never just going to like organize things according to these emergent data-driven groupings. You have to go by what's relevant to the business. But often the business hasn't done this data-driven analysis. And so I think that's an opportunity to guide the business categories by what's in the data. And there's definitely can be value there. And I guess that leads into, what I alluded to before about the question of labeled data. In particular, from the context of consulting, you don't necessarily have a long timeline available to you. So it could be a couple week or maybe a couple month engagement. And so what that means is that you're often limited by the data that's available to you and to the organization that you're working with. If there's not nicely labeled data for, say, your text categorization model at hand, then you probably don't have the opportunity to train one up, because you're going to end up burning all of your runway on just getting data. Then everyone's going to be sad that they didn't end up getting something that could be useful. So then often turn to unsupervised approaches like clustering or topic modeling. So there can be a lot of value in that, and that's important, but it does mean that I think you do see a lot of these topic modeling projects and clustering just because, didn't have any other options because there wasn't labeled data. I have been fortunate enough to be involved in projects where you have an organization that understands that, to get value, you actually have to invest in collection of data. And so then that changes a bit, taking the organization on this journey of how do we design data collection practices? How do we uplift existing workflows so that data collection happens as part of it? Because it's quite costly to have an expert who's got a job to do sit down and just do all this annotation work, which can take, hours, weeks of time. The better thing to do is just have them do their day-to-day job of whether they're reviewing documents or whatever it might be, and actually capturing the decisions that they're making as part of that workflow. And so that's where, as a consultant, you can try to workshop this and sort of come up with strategies where you can help augment the workflow with those sorts of tooling. It's sort of becomes a bit of a cliche that data science is like 80% data cleaning and 20% model training, but there's obviously truth to that. And it depends on what stage of the project you're in, but it's really important to spend that time thinking about problem definition, how to capture the data. You can even talk about it like label engineering. How do we actually come up with an annotation schema that captures the phenomena that we're interested in a way that A, we can capture, and B, that is something that's useful for a model to actually learn from. When people talk about what's the future of data science and, we've got auto ML and data scientists will be automated over job, it's like, I'd actually like to not have to keep turning the model grid search or architecture search sort of thing by hand. I would like that to happen automatically, but you still need someone who understands the label engineering side of things. I've also heard people talking about, if we're talking about deep learning, then there's a role that might emerge in the future is loss function engineer, where it's like, okay, you've got the architecture search, but you need someone to tune the loss function for the problem that you're trying to solve. I'm looking forward to that. I don't think it's a thing to be worried about.
Yeah, so clearly coding is very important for data science, but do you have some other advice to people who want to get into this space? So, for example, what skills they need or what steps they can take?
Yeah. So I get asked this question a bit. So I have a few thoughts here. I think one thing is that people fall into the trap of feeling like they have to learn all of the data science things, like all of your standard machine learning models and statistical models, and be able to sort of bust them out and understand them fully. And I mean, you do need to have some strong competency and familiarity with all that sort of stuff, like obviously. But I think the important thing to realize is that as far as learning this stuff goes, you're going to be learning on the job for a long time. Like that's part of it. And that's part of what I love about it. I think some people feel like they have to learn the whole curriculum before the job interview. And I think that's the trap to fall into. I think there's plenty of lists of foundational ML techniques and statistical techniques that you can go out and find. And I think being able to talk to them is important. And so being able to understand, when something's a supervised or unsupervised machine learning problem and which particular models are going to be well suited to different kinds. And that's super important. As far as preparing yourself for making yourself look attractive to hiring people. I think the biggest thing is that you want to show people that you grok data and you can do stuff with data and you can discover insights. The advice you often hear is have some sort of portfolio. So the best way to do that is probably have a GitHub account or GitLab and find some data set, find some problem and come up with an analysis. It's obviously pretty easy to go out and find a Kaggle data set and do that, but that's probably not going to stand out so much. I think having more of an end-to-end problem where you've actually thought about, well, how would I get the data set for this? And that's obviously going to make it a harder problem. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to go and collect your own data set, but something where you've really had to actually think about these sorts of challenges that maybe had a bit of data cleaning. I think the important characteristics of data science are thinking critically about data is one. And so not just treating the data that you get as truth. There's like that sort of meme is like, there's no such thing as raw, true data. It's like, it's just information. And then it's up to you what you do with it and how you interpret it. And you have to remember that the data was captured in some particular way. There was some phenomenon that was producing it. So when you're doing these sorts of analyses, or just when you're talking to people in interviews, try and find opportunities where you can demonstrate that you understand that data is not this sort of like objective truth, that it was the product of a process, usually whether it's human generated or not, but in particular human generated, because it's just full of all sorts of interesting biases. So I've been looking at it as an example. I've been looking at the Melbourne City Council pedestrian counting data set that's sort of looking at foot traffic for like the last 10 years. And I was talking to someone who's involved in looking after this data set. And he mentioned something that hadn't even occurred to me. I've been looking at it for a while, which is that the sensors around the city, they actually get moved every so often. And, if you move that sensor, that's obviously going to have a big impact on the patterns that you're seeing. But like, especially if you move it and it gets moved like downstream, so to speak, of a tram stop, it's suddenly going to get a spike in pedestrian traffic. And you might look at that and say, oh, well, clearly there's more people moving around there this year. But no, the sensor got moved. So rambling a little bit here now, but what I'm trying to say is when you're trying to make yourself sort of stand out from the crowd, don't just have a portfolio turning the Kaggle cranks and showing that you've got competency over the models, which, you want to demonstrate, but you want to go beyond that. You want to sort of show that you can think critically about what's going on with the data. And then I guess a sort of a secondary thing, aside from the critical thinking, is like, well, what's actually valuable? And I think this is one of the harder things about data science. Probably, really the hardest thing is like, when you're looking at a data set, when you've been asked to investigate something, when you're producing a model, how do you know that the work that you're doing is actually producing value? Embedding it in the context of where it's going to be used and thinking about that. What I enjoy about data science is that you are kind of forced to think about that if you want to do it well. Demonstrating to people in interviews or even through your portfolio that you're thinking about the fact that data analysis and machine learning and modeling, it's super fun and exciting, and it's great to play with all these models and shiny things, but what's actually valuable? And so really trying to tie that to the domain, the business context that you're dealing with. The thing that I would say is that that's not only is it one of the hardest things, it's something that you really only develop a appreciation for after doing it for a while. It's a thing that you practice. So I wouldn't necessarily expect people to be brilliant at that at the start of their career, but I guess trying to at least demonstrate that you're thinking in that way, that you've got an appreciation for that, because that's what people will, if they see that, they'll think, oh, great, this is something that we can cultivate into, someone who's just going to be able to be a much more valuable contributor.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice on how to stand out from the crowd, and critical thinking. It's really, really important.
Yeah, because like what you said, this is something, the kind of a soft skill, right, that you learn. It's not just you read a book or you see something and then voila, it's magical. And having that in mind, you talk about, how people to start in career, etc. There will be anything else that you have to add in terms of the next steps, in a mid-level data scientist? What else they could do to further develop their career, considering that they have already developed what you mentioned?
Yeah. So they started their career, they're sort of in flight, and then there's this question of where do you want to go?
What next?
Yeah. I think probably the most important thing is really to think about where do you want to go? Because you can just look for new skills and things. And there's too many things you can go out there and learn. You can't be the expert at everything. That's why we need cross-functional teams, because you have people with all these different strengths working together. So you need to work out, where do you want to go? Just to put this into perspective, I came across someone posting they were looking for some data science roles at an organization recently. I saw this on LinkedIn, and they called out, they had 4 distinct data science roles available. So there was like a data scientist specializing in forecasting, a data scientist specializing in operations research / optimization, someone who specialized in causal modeling and Bayesian modeling. Then they also called out machine learning engineer sort of role. In fact, they actually called it a data science engineer, which is an interesting distinction that probably something that I might even relate to myself a little bit more. The point being, there's all these different directions you could go. So I think step 1 is work out what are you excited by? What do you want to develop? And then I think find someone who does that, and who maybe you can get to be a mentor. Ideally, ask them, like, would you be up for mentoring me? But oftentimes mentoring roles, they don't necessarily have to be like capital M mentor. They're just someone that you've worked out is okay to catch up with, like have a Zoom call or whatever every so often, and they have any tips. So I would say I have various different mentors in my life, some formal, some informal. And the thing is that you sort of do need to proactively reach out and try to get that. And sometimes there is that formal arrangement in your organization, which is great, but don't just limit it to that. Look for other people. Hopefully, you can find some people to help guide you in the direction of the sort of more specialized roles, if that appeals to you. People talk about the T-shaped skills, where if you're specializing in certain directions, well, what have you got at the foundation? Like in a cross-functional team, you have people with different specialties, but you do need some sort of general competencies so that everyone can hopefully work independently on facets of the project. And I guess some of the big call outs I would put there are engineering and coding skills. That's something that I'm quite passionate about myself, is sort of applying best practice engineering skills to data science. I probably come from a little bit more of a software engineering background than many data scientists. And so I obviously find that easier. And so I can see the benefits of doing that. And I think this is something that will probably see more of an increasing acknowledgement of the importance of engineering skill sets in data science. And we're already seeing that now with the calling out of roles like ML engineer. And as I said before, data science engineer, which I think to me covers a bit more than ML engineering. Like you might be having to wrangle like cloud infrastructure to help do your various data engineering stuff. So engineering best practices, like being able to write clean modular code and potentially spin up small bits of infrastructure sort of stuff. Like I think those are important skills that if it's not something that you've come from that area, then that's something to potentially work on. For me personally, I'm less strong in statistics and probability. And so I think that's an area that I would want to work on. And I think there are definitely data science roles out there that if I went and applied for right now with my stats and probability, I probably wouldn't get it. And I think that comes back to the thing I was saying before about don't think that you need to know everything before you go and apply for that job. Obviously, it depends on what the job is, the role is. And then I think the third thing that I'd maybe just call out, this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, I guess like the engineering best practices, is building interactive interfaces for your data science apps or for your data science projects. So having a little bit of HTML and CSS knowledge, not necessarily a whole heap. And there's a bunch of tools in that space that can help you with that. But I've found that really useful in my work. And, there's probably more stuff we could talk about on the bottom of that T-shaped thing, the foundation, but let's leave it there for now.
At the very beginning, you mentioned about the meetup. So you run the Database meetup here in Melbourne. Can you tell us about what the focus and, why you started and what people get out of it?
DataVis Melbourne, everything data visualization. Unpacking that a little bit more, it's the practice of visualizing data sets, putting them into plots and charts and potentially more esoteric sort of visualizations to discover insights and communicate those insights to other people. We talk about a range of things in that area. So, like tools and libraries. So I come from a Python sort of focused myself, but it's open to anyone who does anything with visualization. So people who use Tableau, Power BI, Excel, you can do a visualization on pen and paper. You can do it in PowerPoint. So that it's also the concepts or the sort of the art and craft of data viz itself, independent of the tooling. What goes into good visualizations, what are good practices to represent data, traps you can fall into, why maybe you don't want to use pie chart a lot of the time, or my particular thing that I like to sort of go off against is maybe don't use the word cloud unless it's just meant to look pretty. It's not a great way to visualize quantitative information to do with text. Yeah, and then also people talking about how they use data viz in research is something that we get. There's obviously a lot of different research institutions around Melbourne, and so we've had people talking about visualizing geographic data, biomedical and genomic data. There's a lot of people who have to come up with very custom tooling to help with these sorts of contexts, because they sort of the visualization tooling out of the box doesn't necessarily do what you want, because you got these highly specialized challenges. So the reason me and a few other people originally started this meetup, I went to a one-day seminar on data viz, and I just really enjoyed the conversations I was having. The talks were great, but then talking between the sessions and then at the pub afterwards, I just really enjoyed the conversations. And I guess I had this thought that, wow, if you get a whole bunch of people in a room who the thing that unifies them is their passion for just sort of discovering insights in and communicating data, it turns out that's a really interesting crowd. And I was just like, I want to hang out with these people more. And so that was, it was almost a little bit self-serving. I was like, well, I just want to hang out with these people, and this seems like a good way to do it. And maybe I'll learn what data viz in the process. When I did that, I definitely wasn't really a specialist in data viz at the time. I've done a lot more since then. And so I guess that's the thing about, you host a meetup and then you get the people with the knowledge to come to you and you can watch their talks.
Yeah, that's really cool, because it's an exchange of experience in everything that comes. I think it's the best way to learn, definitely.
So what do you think? What kind of role do meetups play in a technology's professional life? And why do people attend these meetups?
Good question. And I've asked myself this a bit, because not so much at the moment, obviously, but before we all started sort of working from home and meetups went an in-person thing, I was attending a lot of meetups. I think maybe I became a little bit addicted to it. I don't know. So I think, just socializing with people is something, and socializing with people who are into shared interests, like that's a massive component. So, but then, I think there definitely are aspects that can be beneficial to your career. So obviously networking is a really big one. Just getting to know the people in the industry that you're in, or the profession that you're in, I should probably say. And then, but like, you don't know what people are out there and what they're doing. And so it's always interesting striking up a conversation with people at these meetups and just learning about, I didn't even realize people did what you do. Like, that's cool. Also, it's an opportunity to get up and talk about a topic. Meetups are a great place to sort of kick off public speaking. If you haven't had experience before, meetups, they're pretty much always open to those sorts of, and if you ask, they'll support you. I often say this on their website, and we're happy to give you advice on how to go about speaking if you haven't done it before. So yeah, it's a great on-ramp into working towards speaking at conferences. Obviously, the idea there is that speaking in public on a topic that you know something about, or that, you've just done a bit of research, and so you've collected a bunch of information that other people haven't done. So you don't necessarily have to be an expert in something. It's just you've spent a bit of time thinking and preparing and researching a topic. Doing that in public, it's an opportunity for you to sort of work on your personal brand. And I think you see a lot of articles talking about this, and I think it's actually quite valuable. I've certainly discovered this. I didn't really intentionally go about doing it, but I think working on my own personal brand is a sort of a thing that I accidentally started doing. And then once I realized what I was doing, I was like, well, and it started to pay dividends. I was like, I should probably do more of this. And yeah, so I guess that personal brand for me is probably data visualization and building out interactive interfaces in Python in particular is sort of one area that I think probably become somewhat known for in the data space to a certain extent. So one way in particular that played out is sort of moving on from meetups more specifically, was contributing to Dash, Plotly Dash, which is a interactive library for building out web apps, specifically, things that are like dashboards, interactive interfaces for models and things that you've developed. And I sort of became really excited by this project, and so I started hanging out on the forums heaps and just answering heaps and heaps of questions, and ended up a little while later, it actually ended up I got a job offer from Plotly, because they said, well, you clearly know as much as anyone about this topic, because like it was a new library, so there weren't any experts, and the person who had created it said to me, well, I can see that you know it because it's all here in this public forum. So I guess that's sort of an example of that, working on your personal brand thing. I guess how I would characterize all of what I've just said, including the meetups and maybe contributing to open source online and things like that. I heard this described by, I wish I could remember who it was. It was someone on one of the many podcasts I listened to. And the way they described it was try to do things that maximizes your exposure to serendipity. Serendipity being sort of unknown, random, like molecules bumping around and you bump into an interesting opportunity. So do things that mean that more interesting opportunities are likely to arise. And so for me, that was doing stuff on the Plotly forums. Also going to meetups is very much another example of that. I've definitely struck up many interesting friendships and professional connections that have resulted in sort of hard to express value, but value nonetheless. And and I think that whole maximize your opportunity to serendipity, like I think it's the sort of thing that probably is a thing that's valuable just more generally in life. The more you do things that put you in a position where unknown but possibly interesting events happen, it's probably just going to lead to a more interesting life.
You do a lot of networking. You mentioned basically some of the reasons you do it. What about those people who are shy or not super social? So what would be the best tips you have for them achieve and find out whatever they need in terms of that space of the networking?
Yeah, interesting. So it's funny because I did not think of myself as someone who was into networking and doing coffee with people. It wasn't a thing that came naturally to me, and I don't even know how it sort of started, but I think I sort of worked out that I was feeling like I was entering an industry that I didn't know much about, and I was just trying to learn as much as I could. So I think first of all, I say, like, I'm not someone who's super outgoing, extroverted, and once you sort of do it a few times, you start to work out there's sort of just a bit of a pattern to it, and it doesn't have to be that stressful. But I totally get that it can be if it's not something that comes naturally. So I totally understand. I think what I would say is when you're reaching out to someone, and so I guess this is a strategy is it's perfectly fine to reach out to someone that you don't know, and so I think LinkedIn is a common place where I do this. Try to introduce yourself and try to strike up a conversation and see if you could, maybe get coffee or something. I think that what I would suggest is find some way in which you might, like, that interaction would be valuable for them. Now, especially if you're just sort of getting kind of started, you probably necessarily don't have a network, or it's not necessarily about business value connections that you can offer them, but you've probably got ideas, knowledge, experience from somewhere that this person might find useful. That's what you're looking for. You're trying to find people who you can strike up those sorts of conversations with. So when I find someone on LinkedIn that I think, oh, this person does interesting stuff, and I try and think about what projects that I've worked on, what sort of things that I've come across recently that maybe this person would find interesting. I'd sort of say, like, hey, I've done some of these things. I see that you've done it too. Like, it'd be really interesting could we grab a coffee? I think people would often say, you offer to buy someone coffee. It doesn't really work quite so well now, but I guess buy the coffee when you're over Zoom. Often you will also find people who, if you just sort of make it sound like it could be an interesting conversation, they're not necessarily after anything in particular. Some people, they're busy and they may ignore you, and don't worry about it. Like, people are busy. If they ignore you, that's fine. But you will find people out there who will like the idea of catching up and talking about whatever, if what you find interesting is something they also find interesting, then go for it.
Yeah, definitely there will be people that will not accept or just simply ignore. Don't stop there, keep going. Until you find someone that will answer your question. And to your point, maybe not pay a coffee now, but maybe send some donuts.
That's a good one, yeah. Well, I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but you talked a little bit about personal branding. So I wanted to come back a little bit to that. So what social media channels you use, and is there anything else you wanted to share on this topic?
Yeah. So I guess my go-to social media platform is Twitter. And, if you're in the data tech world, there's a lot of people out there on Twitter. The interesting thing about Twitter is that it's asymmetric. The other person doesn't have to agree to follow you for that connection to happen. So you can follow whoever you want. And so I sort of worked this out. I was like, oh wow, there's all these interesting people doing stuff that I find fascinating. And I just started following people. And this just kept on happening. And no one told me, I didn't realize this. I don't think they make it public, but there's actually a limit on the number of people you can follow. It depends on how many people you have following you. I think they just want to try and keep that ratio not out of skew. But basically, the limit is 5,000 people until you yourself have 5,000 people follow you. Then that gets bumped up and to keep it some sort of balance there. So I didn't know this until I went to follow my 5,000 and first person and it said, sorry, you've hit the limit for now. I'm like, what? The interesting side effect that happened there was that I ended up basically, I didn't just sort of follow anyone. It was someone who sounded like they do something in data science, data analytics, data visualization, natural language processing, and web development. And, that sounded like they might have something to say. And then another interesting thing happened, which is that I discovered this tool. It's called Nuzzle, and you connect it to Twitter, and then it just listens to your feed, and it just gives you a digest of, like, it's basically just literally a ranked list of the most retweeted links from your network. Now that sounds like dead simple, algorithm for curating interesting stuff, and it is, but it's surprisingly effective. And I think the interesting thing here is that Twitter could do that for you, but they're probably not assuming that you've done all this work curating your feed. And so they're like, well, we'll take care of that for you and we'll curate your own timeline. But because I happened to have done this, and then there was this other service, what it means is I get this sort of like digest of anything that registers in the tech worlds that I pay attention to, and then I get a sort of an email feed. And that's been surprisingly useful. Like I sort of have feel like I have a reasonably good finger on the pulse of, big developments at least. There's obviously heaps of stuff I'm not hearing about, but the big sort of notable things I tend to come across. So this is an interesting little sort of like information hack that I accidentally discovered. And I guess on the topic of, staying on top of things, the other thing would just be listening to way too many podcasts that I really have time for, having to listen on like 2x speed to really get through it. I think what I'd really wish my podcatcher app would tell me, you are subscribed to this many podcasts, which means that you have X hours of podcasts coming in a week. And at your current rate, this is how much you're clearing. Because I actually don't have a good sense of that. I just get it. Am I absorbing, keeping on top of the incoming feeds? So I feel like there's a bit of a gap in the market there for the power podcast listeners.
That might be an idea for someone who's listening to us, that to create this tool, this app.
Yeah.
You were talking about tools. So just to see if you have anything else in terms of tools or technology that you'd recommend to your peers in the industry, beyond the ones that you have mentioned already.
Yeah, I guess I talked a little bit about Dash, and I think I would say a bit more generally, there's actually a whole family of Python libraries for rapidly spinning up web interfaces, and not just Python. So the kind of an analog tool in the R world is Shiny. When Dash first came out, people called it Shiny for Python. In terms of Python, which I'm more familiar with, there's a few other libraries, Streamlit, Panel, and Voila are examples. And I actually gave a talk surveying these different tools, so I can include that in the show notes, a link to that. But I guess what I would say there is, as a data practitioner, being able to spin up a web app that can expose the model that you've developed or the analysis as an interactive dashboard. There's a data scientist called Joel Grus that has described this as having a data superpower, and I totally agree. You don't need to get a web dev team to come in and build out your interface, because that's often not a possibility. And then even if it is, it costs money and then they have to disappear and you got feature freeze, you can't actually extend it. So basically being able to prototype your own interface that allows you to sit the user of what you're building down in front of it more quickly. And it's kind of like, I guess, it really helps facilitate applying agile practices to data science. And this was a book called Agile Data Science 2.0. And that's the premise of this book. Well, there's a few, but that's one that I definitely took out of it, which is that if you can spin up your own little web apps, you can tighten that feedback loop from the consumers up much more quickly. And there's other reasons why these things are really useful also for building out little tooling. So for ML engineers and people who are sort of in that sort of context, you just often need tiny little GUI tools that are fit for purpose. And so that's specifically what Streamlit is designed to use. You know, a lot of people say, oh, I need a web app to do a thing. And so they start looking at Flask and Matplotlib. And that sort of feels like that's what you had to do, you know, maybe 5 years ago, but there's just way better options now. Is definitely one thing that I'd suggest people have a look at if that sounds like it could be of value to you. The other areas that I'm keen to explore myself is basically libraries for distributed compute. So often people will, you know, when you're thinking about that analytics at scale, you're thinking about Spark and maybe PySpark. There's a new sort of range of tools for helping with this sort of stuff. And in particular, one that I'm keen to get more hands-on experience with is Dask. And so you can sort of think about Dask as native Python version of Spark, but it sort of ends up being more flexible. You're not restricted by the PySpark API, and it interfaces with all of the PyData tools that you're probably familiar with, like Pandas. And so that's something that's getting a lot of traction. And so definitely something that could be worth exploring. When you're building data products and ML models, typically we end up thinking about things as pipelines. And so tooling for building out pipelines is obviously super important. There's a couple of libraries that are sort of more recent that I think are really helpful for that. So one is Prefect, which actually plays pretty well with Dask. And the other one that I've been using a bit recently is DVC, Data Version Control, but it also has some really cool pipelining features in addition to being able to version control data through Git and interfacing with cloud libraries. So, you know, obviously I could ramble about more cool tools for a while. So that'll probably do for now.
Yeah, awesome. So is there anything in particular that you wanted to talk about but we haven't really discussed yet?
One more thing, a thing that I get excited by, I guess it is kind of another tool sort of, but no, it's actually a suggestion. If you're someone who's not super comfortable working on the command line, and I guess in particular, I'm thinking about a bash terminal. You know, I know this is probably could also apply for PowerShell, but I actually can't use PowerShell at all. So much of the tech world is becoming cloudified, and you know, it's like everything is code, infrastructure is code, and a lot of this deployment, it's all happening in the cloud. And so I often find myself working on projects where I need to remotely connect SSH into a machine in the cloud, and there are connectivity issues. And I know there are some useful tools like VS Code. You can SSH through the VS Code on your machine into the remote. It's not always possible, and there can be challenges with that. And so being comfortable working on the command line, there's really cool tools. Like, for example, one I'd throw out is Byobu, BYOBU. It's actually a wrapper around tmux, which is something you might have come across to help you manage persistent terminal connections and then split them into different views. Byobu makes that a whole lot easier. That's how I got using it. And so it kind of ends up being like having a window manager, but for your terminals. For me, it's been a massive productivity enhancer, being able to do my work in a terminal. And then also being familiar with sort of, you know, various bash commands, being able to pipe things through grep, sort, head, all of those sorts of, you know, you can find plenty of tutorials. Just having some basic sort of familiarity with how to do some of this piping and can be a real game changer. And lastly, I'm going to squeeze in one last tool, which is related to doing data analysis on the command line. And it's a tool that I actually find surprisingly few people know about. And it's an amazing tool called VisiData. And it's basically like a tabular data viewer, visual tabular data viewer in your terminal. Kind of looks like you're looking at a data frame, whether you're in Pandas or in R. And you can actually interact with this data like you would Pandas. And you can sort of manipulate the data, explore it. And so it's just a vastly better experience from just sort of printing out the contents of the CSV file. But you can even edit the file directly and even embed that viewer inside a Python REPL. So you've got this amazing tabular viewer inside. And anyway, I could wax lyrical about that tool some more, but I'll stop. Yeah, check it out.
Great. So how can people find you if they want to connect?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, as mentioned before, I'm on Twitter. So my handle is @NLetcher, NLETCHER. You're welcome to drop me an email if you want. My email is ned@nednet, with a T at the end. As you've probably gathered, I do like talking data, tech, engineering, and I'm always keen to hear, what the stories that people, where they're coming from, where they're wanting to go. I think that's, there's so many different, I guess the journey that everyone's sort of going somewhere different, have come from somewhere else. And so I'm always keen to share and exchange stories.
Great. And who knows, maybe mentor someone.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you ask nicely.
Nice. Yeah, we will include those in the podcast notes. Yeah, well, Ned, I really enjoyed our conversation today, and I wanted to thank you for your time today and also for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us.
It was my pleasure. It was great talking to you both.
I've learned a few things. Not a few, a lot of things actually.
Awesome.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening in today. Following our Learn, Adapt, and Succeed motto, the most interesting takeaways for me were about 1. Different ways we can evolve our network to be more meaningful and learn from the people around us. 2. How quickly natural language, or NLP, is changing our daily lives. 3. How many more language models we're going to see in the future, which is an exciting space to watch. 4. What traits are good to develop to grow in the data science area. And 5, and most importantly, you don't need to learn everything that exists in data science. That would be humanly impossible. Hence we have cross-functional teams. But still, keep learning is the best way to go. I hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Bye!